to have the chance of joining this event and, of course, the chance of discussing this topic with you all. As Laura said, this is part of a larger research where I discuss at the intersection between race, space, and tourism. This is a topic that I have been working on for several years and was part of my dissertation, and it's part of my current manuscript, which precisely deals with how the spatial politics of tourism development impacted the life of everyday people in the city, mostly Black people living in the surroundings of the touristic areas of the city. Um, I'm very grateful for the chance of talking to you, especially to Laura de Moya Guerra, my colleague, to Javier Gonzalez, and of course to Professor Aldo Lauria Santiago for the invitation. So I will do a very brief presentation, and of course I'm open to discuss whatever question you have. This is a working project, so any questions, suggestions will be highly welcome, of course. But before going into the presentation, I want to share with you an image of something that happened in Cartagena very recent, which is an expression, a present expression of these topics that I will discuss here this afternoon. I hope that you can see the presentation right now. I guess that many of you have seen this picture before. Are you looking at the picture right now?
Yes, we can see it.
Yes? Okay. Well, this happened in Cartagena only a few weeks ago, and this, of course, triggered a lot of debates in the city regarding the issue of racism. For some people, this picture, the portrayal of these Black women next to these white mestizas models, is an expression of how the bodies of the Black women are incorporated into the touristic image, and also how all this portrayal or representation or performance is characteristical of a romanticization of the slavery past in the city. So many of us, of course, were critical about this particular performance, and at the same time, many of us were wondering in which moment along our history this became an issue. This became fairly common. In Cartagena, this is not very rare. This happens all the time, either in weddings or in openings, which was the case. Even in public and official events, many of these Black women are hired to participate in the events. Many of them are portrayed as decorations for the attendance. So of course, this caused a lot of anger in the activists in the city who denounced these kind of practicals as an expression of racism. So what we are trying to do here is to approach this issue from the historical perspective. Try to go to the past of Cartagena to understand how these circumstances came out in the recent history. So I will proceed to do a very brief presentation. It's not going to last too long. So after that, of course, feel free to make any questions regarding the topic. If you have any question in Spanish, por favor, feel welcome to do it as well. And let me know if you can see my presentation. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can see. Can you put? Yes.
Is it moving?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, as Laura said, the title of the presentation is Tourism and the Commodification of Blackness in the Colombian Caribbean during the 20th century. Since the mid-20th century, the Colombian state and private agents joined efforts to turn Cartagena into an international tourist destination. This presentation analyzes how the inclusion of the city within the Caribbean touristic market led to the commodification of Blackness through the incorporation of Black bodies into the city's touristic image, including brochures, postcards, travel literature, advertisements, etc., between the 1960s and the 1980s. Despite this apparent inclusion, Black men and women met with a double standard reality. Despite being progressively incorporated into the city's image, they still face racial discrimination and police harassment while working in the touristic areas. Thus, specialization played out as a double-edged sword that made their bodies commodifiable while still a target to everyday forms of exclusion. This reality opened up possibilities as much as challenges for the palenqueros, a racialized migrant community trying to find their place within a changing city. In a broad sense, my research addresses the intersection between race, space, and tourism during the making of Cartagena as an international and heritage tourist destination during the 20th century. Since the mid-20th century, the central government hoped that tourism could propel the national economy. To do so, they invested millions to refashion Cartagena's city center by restoring the colonial landscape. The city's colonial past was appealing abroad. The history of the Spanish Empire and the adventures of the British pirates that raided their domains in the Caribbean caught the attention of the United States audiences. In Calling to Colombia, a short documentary produced by the Metropolitan Mayor in 1940, Cartagena is introduced as one of the most important Spanish bastions in the continent, whose history was marked by the assaults of English and French pirates and buccaneers. Another production, the film The Spanish Main, that came out in 1945, narrated the adventures of a Dutch captain who was captured in the coast of Cartagena by the Spanish and sentenced to death. These references about the city in the popular culture abroad may have influenced the elaboration of its image in the following decades. For the local elites, who largely self-identified as whites and of Spanish descent, the colonial past was the pillar of the city's identity. The restoration of the walled city embodied the elites called to Hispanidad and was a clear move to whiten the urban space by mirroring European architecture and its spatial forms. Colonial houses, for example, were painted in white to mimic those of southern Spain. On the other hand, for the national government, the restoration was a necessary step to increase the country's touristic appeal within the Caribbean market. While the legacy of the colonial past certainly appealed to international tourists, they were also interested in the city's racial diversity. In fact, when describing the colonial quarter, travelers used to include Black bodies within the landscape. A note from the Boston Globe described the convent and fortresses not without mentioning the presence of, open quote, half-clad Blacks who joke and sway while filling the hulls of wooden sailboats with bottles, salt, and cans, extracting in exchange coconuts, wood, and fruits of every color and smell, close quote. Despite the local authorities' efforts to create a gap between leisure and labor, travel literature eagerly depicted the Black labor embodies as part of the colonial landscape. Another note from the Boston Globe mentioned women vendors, most likely palenqueras, open quote, with trays of sweet meats balanced on their heads, stroll along cobble, maze-like streets so narrow that sometimes both walls can be touched as you walk along, close quote. Not only international tourists seem eager to highlight the city's Black bodies as part of the touristic image. National magazines usually included them when depicting Cartagena. The city hosted the National Beauty Pageant every year since 1961. This event was not only meant to celebrate womanhood and beauty. The media coverage was critical for the city to reach national audiences. As the time passed, it became the city's most important touristic event and Cartagena's best opportunity to attract domestic tourism. When national magazines, such as Cromos, covered the event during the 1960s, they illustrated the articles with a wide variety of photographs about the city, particularly about the colonial quarter and the nearby beaches and hotels. However, they also included pictures of the beauty queens posing next to the locals, who often happened to be people of color or Black musicians and dancers participating in gatherings organized by the contest. You can see it here. This is a cover of the Cromos magazine from the 1960s, and you can see how the portrayal of the city in this national magazines created in Bogota and interior of the country usually included pictures about of black practitioners or dances in the covers. This might draw from an early commodification of the black bodies within the touristic representations about the Colombian Caribbean, as much as the historical racialization of the region made by people from the Andes. To be certain, some Cartageneros did not feel comfortable about these representations. In 1950, a journalist criticized a cumbia dance show offered to international delegates from the recently created Andean community, La Comunidad Andina. He commented on a conversation he had with the Chilean ambassador, who wondered whether that was a typical dance from Cartagena, stating, open quote, that is not only African, but pornographic, close quote. The journalist suggested to avoid these presentations since they negatively affected the city's image. When it came to elaborate touristic representations about the city, Cartageneros prioritized elements related to its colonial past. Tourist guides, brochures, and postcards from the 1950s and 1960s centered on descriptions and images about the walled city, fortresses, religious architecture, while strategically skipped mentions about the public market or the slums, despite their proximity to the touristic areas. Similarly, images rarely depicted Black laborers or people of color altogether. When talking about the history of the city, they built up a narrative centered on the foundation of the city by the Spanish conquistador, the multiple attacks by pirates and buccaneers, and the independence. Slavery was rarely mentioned unless it was to refer to the legacy of Pedro Claver, a Spanish priest who devoted his life to take care of enslaved people. However, tourist guides from the late 1970s seem to depict the city in different terms. While they reproduce the same narrative centered on the colonial past, they included images showing Black laborers, including palenqueras, as you may see here in this image. A tourist guide from 1977 even mentioned a tourist attraction called El Pueblito, a set of houses that resemble the typical architecture in the rural areas of the northern region. Referring to this attraction, the guide says, open quote, is a manifestation of the tropical culture and the indigenous and Black roots of our people. Here too, the touch of a colonial Spain can be seen in La Ermita, an imposing all-white building, close quote. Touristic ads produced by local authorities also included the image of the palenqueras. Similarly, photos of the palenqueras posing next to contestants of the National Beauty Pageant began to appear in the city's newspaper as well. Why did the touristic representations and attractions produced in Cartagena transition from centering on elements related to the Spanish colonial era to include elements celebrating diversity? My hypothesis is that local authorities and entrepreneurs eagerly tried to embrace historical representations about the Caribbean, which commodified Blackness as part of the tropical picturesque. It's in an effort to position Cartagena within the regional market. Images of the palenquera, for example, clearly resemble those already visible in touristic brochures and postcards from other places in the Caribbean. These depicted Black women dressed in colorful clothes, necklaces, and earrings while carrying heavy fruit baskets on top of their heads. However, this apparent inclusion was contradicted by the everyday experience of the palenqueras. The restoration of the walled city, the colonial city, which embodied the elite's call to Hispanidad as much as the recreation of the colonial landscape for the sake of heritage tourism, came up with harsh regulations about the use of urban space. This severely impacted the livelihood of the palenqueras who sold fruits and sweets in the streets. As part of the measures to restore the colonial landscape, the police harassed them, confiscated their merchandise, and arrested them. Harassment usually came with racial slurs. Cristina Salgado, a street vendor during the early 1980s, recalled to be confronted by a cop who referred to her and other palenqueras as esas negras de mierda. Local authorities, through customary practices of policing amid a context of urban change that recreated European-minded aesthetics, enforced a subtle model of racial segregation in Cartagena, which impacted the life of people of African descent working within the touristic areas. Palenqueras fell in a double dynamic of inclusion and exclusion. They were persecuted and discriminated against, but their laboring bodies became part of the city's tropical picturesque. In the words of Yadmila Bausa Vargas, the Palenquera were, open quote, engaged in a continuing struggle between being portrayed as decorative figures for tourism and being devaluated as individuals whose rights are neglected, if not outright overlooked and denied, close quote. It is yet to be revealed how the Palenqueras reacted at first to the commodification of their bodies, or whether they actively participated in the remaking of their image for the sake of tourism. For example, somewhere between the 1970s and the 1990s, they began using colorful dresses that clearly resemble those already visible across the Caribbean. Some people openly opposed to the commodification of their bodies. In 1955, for example, a journalist recalled an episode while visiting Shambaku, a Black majority slum near the walled city. While trying to take a picture of two young girls, a woman told them, "Hide yourself, negra. They want to take a picture to sell you in Bogota." Others preferred to strategically use the commodification of their bodies for the sake of their own benefit. In 1976, Councilman Asisclo de Avila, a leader from the mostly Black village of Boca Chica, suggested charging for entry to the colonial fortresses located there and investing the income back in the village. After all, he said, open quote, "Tourists do not go to Boca Chica to visit the San Fernando fortress, but to see the Blacks and their behavior," close quote. Somehow, the Avila tried to even and profit from the asymmetrical relations of power of these touristic encounters. Aware of the commodification of their Blackness, some resisted the gaze, while others chose to comply with the representations in order to achieve some economic reward. Rather than being passively turned into objects of tourist gaze, locals played their part in this encounter. To conclude, by the 1990s, Blackness was a commonplace in touristic representations about Cartagena. According to Joel Straker, open quote, Blacks are visually depicted as fruit sellers on the beach, folkloric dancers at a tourist show, and fishermen silhouetted the setting sun, while tourists are portrayed as white. For the most part, blacks appear in the tourist literature merely as part of the picturesque or tourist fun, taking a secondary role to the city's beaches and colonial architecture, close quote. The incorporation of Black bodies within the touristic representations can be traced back to the mid-century, but became more visible since the late 1970s as the city tried to find its place within the Caribbean market. Blackness came to be represented as part of the Cartagena's tropical picturesque. I contended this was in order to mirror traditional representations about the Caribbean, which historically commodified Blackness. However, this apparent inclusion did not prevent Black people from suffering the effects of the spatial politics that sought to recreate the colonial landscape for the sake of heritage tourism. The regulations over the use of urban space affected the livelihood of Black laborers who worked in the area as street vendors, particularly the palenqueras. Tourism development turned their laboring bodies into icons while limited their chances to meet their citizenship rights. This double dynamic of inclusion and exclusion defined their experience during the remaking of Cartagena in the 20th century. However, Black people did not remain passive before this double dynamic. When they did not resist the gaze of tourists, they strategically used the commodification of their bodies for their own benefit. This pattern remains to this day. Some palenqueras no longer sell fruits and sweets in the streets, but charge tourists willing to take pictures with them. This practice proves to be more profitable and also eases their labor conditions. Furthermore, they have embraced the heritage discourse, which has been historically tied to tourism, to claim the right to work in the area. In 2019, when Angelina Cassiani, a palenquera who usually was hired to pose next to the winners of the National Beauty Pageant, had her merchandise confiscated by the police, a protest sparked in the city. Some banners during the protest read, "Somos Patrimonio," we are heritage. They insisted that they were entitled to work in the area because they were an icon of the city and part of its heritage. Rather than a top-down process that successfully rendered the palenqueras as mere objects of touristic consumption, the commodification of blackness has been also a complex scenario through which Black men and women have found a way to assert their citizenship rights in the midst of a changing reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Deavila, for sharing us with us all of this. It's amazing the work that you have been doing all of these years. So can you stop sharing the screen, please?
Sure, yeah.
We would like to know if there's some questions that people can make, both Spanish and English. If you have questions for Dr. Deavila, I have mine, but I want to give you first the opportunity to do the questions. So I see here that Andres Gonzalez has a raised hand. So Andres, please go ahead.
Hello, excellent presentation, amazing research. I was wondering something that you didn't mention, but I was wondering if, like, in the sources that you were analyzing, there was some references to sex tourism, like, because all this commodification of the Black body is presented here in a very violent but sanitized way. So it seems that these palenqueras, they are like embodying this kind of tradition that in a way deprives them of these like sexual things. So I don't know like how it fits there. So
good. Thank you, Andres. Should I answer right now or wait for the other questions? What do you think, Laura?
I think you can, if you feel comfortable, you
sure.
can.
Yeah.
Making people. Yeah. So.
Okay, great. Okay, I couldn't find any reference related to sex tourism and the palenqueras because there is a sense in the city that the palenqueras are, and this is like a common perception, in somehow also related to the reality, and it's that palenqueros used to practice endogamy while living in the city. After they migrated to the city, they married among themselves. They created enclaves because of racism, of course, and some people argue that also in order to defend their culture and their authenticity. That's like the common perception in the city. So that there has been this prevailing idea that palenqueras never marry or had sexual encounters with foreigners or white people. So this sexualization of their bodies never took place to this day. But of course, there is an exotization, a sexualization of the Black female bodies different from those of the palenqueras. But I couldn't find any reference at that point. I guess that has to do with the fact sex tourism was a reality back in the mid-20th century. We know that, but it was not part of the touristic representation. I couldn't find any reference to that or any piece of visual culture that portrayed the sexualized body of local women. But I guess that's something that's going to happen after, perhaps in the 1990s. But I could not find any source that could lead me to believe that there was an active sexualization of their bodies at that historical moment. Of course, there was enough evidence to talk about prostitution, and about yeah, prostitution, sex tourism, but not specifically related or yeah, related to the commodification of Black female bodies at that moment.
Thank you, Orlando. Thank you,
Mhm.
Andres, for your question. We have a question in the chat. Are you able to see the question, Orlando, in the
Yeah,
chat?
let me check. Yeah,
Okay.
from Kate Correa. Yeah.
Yes. And we also have two more rising hands. So I don't know if you want to do like an around, or now we have like a bunch of questions, or you want to go question by question.
I would prefer to go question by question.
Awesome.
As long as we have enough time to do it.
Okay, I will read aloud. Everybody can see the question, I think, but it's Kate Correa. As part of the recent resistance from the palenqueras and street workers in the 2019 protests, what material demands or conditions do you know of that the workers in Cartagena continue to make? Thank you.
Yes, well, that's a critical question. What they are demanding, they have several demands, and I was discussing this with Candia Obeso, which is a scholar from Palenquero descent who is doing a dissertation precisely on the issue of heritage and tourism. And she was explaining to me that the working conditions of the Palenqueras, of course, are very demanding. They don't have access to sanitary services, to bathrooms. They face harsh conditions to practice the labor in the city. But what they are demanding the most is the chance of working freely in the downtown area without the disruption by the police, without facing the authorities trying to sanitize the public space. So it's mostly related to that. So whenever there is an issue regarding the office of public space trying to confiscate their merchandise and to displace them from the working place, there are demands by them, but their demands are mostly related to the issue of occupying the urban space, occupying the space where they perform their labor.
Okay, thank you. I will give in the to the order I think has been rising. So in my next is Sandra Mendiola for the question.
Hello, Orlando. I really enjoy your presentation, and I am, of course, very interested in street vendors in general. And so when you were talking, I kept on thinking of Salvador Bahia in Brazil, and how a lot of the women vendors, right,
Yeah.
who actually also happen to be Afro-Brazilians, right,
Sure.
as part of this heritage, right, of tourism and claiming rights to the city, right, they use the right to sell and to be present through food, right? So I was wondering if you have found similar examples of this phenomenon. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, that's precisely some of the activities that they do in the downtown. For example, as much as in the case of Salvador de Bahia, which is a fascinating case that I'm also looking at, mostly because of the book of Anadelia Romo, who explains this process that has strong connections with the case of Cartagena. And of course, in the case of Cartagena, the palenqueras, their tradition are precisely tied to the culinary traditions of Afro-descendant people in the region. And they sell fruits, of course, but they also sell candies that are part of the culinary traditions of San Basilio de Palenque, the town from where they are. So, of course, food is also part of the performance, because the portrayal of their bodies right now, the way they have redesigned their image, has a lot to do with that, with food and with the incorporation of those elements that are critical for them to claim that they are part of the local heritage, because also food is part of the heritage, and they claim that the economic practice that they do is not only economic, but also has to do with the traditions of the city, mostly because of the food. So of course, there are connections in that sense.
Thank you so much.
Okay, the next person is, in my order, Manuel Garcia Orozco. Is a raising hand.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you for this fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it. I have a couple of questions, and one is that the Palenquera became like almost like a mythical character, like almost a parody of the idea, because some of them are not even from Palenque. And this also comes with an idea that the Maroon Caribbean is bigger than Palenque. Palenque just, let's say, got the resources in terms of politics and stuff, but you know, you find people in Evitar, San Pablo, these towns nearby, where you have also people of Maroon heritage. But I was wondering, as I heard you talking, back in, especially in the mid-20th century, when this promotion of Cartagena as a tourist site happened, and since I feel like this is also amplifying the voices of Black women, and there are no Black women with us, I wonder, well, first in the archive, how many or how much did you find the voices of Black women there, implied or explicitly speaking, and nowadays, how what do they think about these issues that you're portraying? Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. Yeah, that's always a tricky question when we approach to the sources, to the primary sources in the archives. They, of course, they tend to focus more on the voices, on the hegemonic voices of the city. But of course, there were always spaces through which the everyday people from the lower classes has the chance of speaking out. And newspapers, for example, are very critical in that sense because they reveal the voices of the people when they complained about the police harassment. That's always on the newspapers. I had found, of course, some contemporary works from other perspective, from the sociological and more anthropological perspective, that did a lot of ethnographic work, and they included the voices of the Palenqueras. So we can get a lot from that. And since this happened like very recent in historical terms, this is an issue that has been taking place in the last 40 or 50 years. It is possible to do oral history and to get the version of the people that witnessed these events. So it is fairly easy to catch the voices of the palenqueras and in general of the people from the popular classes that went through all this experience of racialization and discrimination that took place in the 20th century. Of course, it is complicated to approach to this topic because there is a prevailing racial silence. So when it comes to discuss this issue, people try to avoid it. But since this has been something that has been pervasive in the last 30 years, that is still taking place in the present, so there is a sense that this has an historical background, that whatever is happening now has an historical past. What's their perception about the situations nowadays? That's something that I haven't wondered because I don't come to the present. My research goes until the 1980s, but of course they are pretty active whenever they want to denounce whatever is happening in the whatever affects them. They became vocal about that and they express themselves. So they are pretty open. They are organized. They have organizations. There are a lot of palenqueros and palenqueras that have made it to the state. So they have like they have become like sort of a spoken person or voceros of their causes as well.
Okay, thank you, Orlando. Vanessa Castañeda is next, raising hand.
Hi, Orlando.
Hola.
Good to see you
Good
again.
to see you again.
And I loved your presentation. And so my question is a little similar to Manuel's. I'll just ask it anyways. And then I have just a kind of general question that I'm just curious to know your thoughts. But one of the things that you said in your presentation was the ways that, you know, there was kind of like this imposition that was happening in kind of tailoring the look of the palenquera to the kind of image that the tourism industry wanted to sell. And I was curious in your archival work if you actually found any evidence of like the palenqueras being their own stakeholders and actually having power to also define the terms in which this image was being created. And what really prompted me was when you brought up Ana Delia Romo's book, where she talks about the power of, you know, the Maiji Santos and the different Candomblé communities in terms of them also stating which images, which kinds of ceremonies are appropriate for the dissemination. And so I was just curious if there's any kind of evidence that you've come across in terms of really highlighting that assertion from the palenquera. And then more generally, because as you know, I do work with the Baianas Yacarajé, so I'm super interested in like, you know, being in dialogue with you. But you know, this is something that affects a lot of older Black women, the ways in which, you know, their bodies are commodified to represent a very specific kind of Blackness, very specific kind of Black woman. And I just wanted to know your thoughts in terms of like, why is this gendered, you know, kind of compilation or definition or creation happening all across Latin America? What are your thoughts? I'm sure this is something that we can all talk about, but I'm just curious, to know, because we see this like in Bahia, we see this in Colombia, we see this in Cuba, we see this in Honduras with the Garifuna women. And so, just kind of wanting to think out loud with you. And thank you again, Orlando.
Thanks to you. Well, that's one of my research questions, in which moment and how they began like dressing in a different manner, how that performance had changed along the time. And I am not really sure about it. I have heard like rumors that at some point an owner of a hotel began dressing the palenqueras with colorful clothes, the palenqueras that were working near his hotel. But I am not so sure about it. I guess that I will have to do some other history to track that transformation, to reveal in which moment that happened and how they intervened their own image. Because I am not so sure about that. I haven't found any source or any archival source that gives me any indication of how that process took place. And regarding the other question about this gender representation of older Black women, I also have the same question, because this is not exclusive of Cartagena. This also happens in Bahia, also happens in Cuba, also happens in Argentina, and I didn't know about that, but there is this research by Professor Liz Moreno who talks about how this representation of older Black women also took place in Argentina, that takes that of course draws from these historical representations about the country and its African heritage, but that's something that happens everywhere. But I am not so sure about why this is so prevailing across Latin America. Perhaps it has to do with this idea of the matronas, these strong Black women who work in the market, who became very visible because of their work in the streets, and perhaps there is something going along with that. But I couldn't say for certain. But that's certainly something that we have to find out in the future, because it's critical to understand these processes across the region and their connections.
Thank you, Orlando. Thank you, Vanessa. Javier, and next, Bob.
Thank you so much, Orlando, for your presentation. You know, I told you before that I'm interested in basically in non-human animals and humans relationships. So my question goes in that territory. So because you began your presentation mentioning bodies, right? So human bodies. but maybe I guess that there are other bodies in related to tourism, Cartagena representations, right? So I was wondering if you know something about when did other animals such as horses maybe were incorporated in those representations that are related to tourism in the city.
Yeah.
I know that also they have bullfights, and but I don't know if you can tell us something about this, if it is recent or I don't know, something that you might want
Okay.
to share with us. Thank you.
Yes, that's not very recent. And actually, I have found postcards from earlier times that included the presence of animals, mostly horses, because the coaches in Cartagena,
Yeah.
because they were they have been pretty common along the history of the city. So I have found like postcards from the early 20th century that already included animals. So that's not very rare. And that has been the case along the history of the city to the present. So, of course, that particular kind of animals are being portrayed in the touristic representations of the city. I could not remember perhaps other kind of animals that also appear in these touristic representations, but something that I found in some of the descriptions, not in the visual culture, but more in the article news in the newspaper articles about Cartagena that were published in the United States press during all this time period, is that some of the representations about the city included the bodies of the animals next to the bodies of the Black people, if they were part of the same landscape. And that's something that is not new, that always happened in the Caribbean, that happened also in the 19th century. And this has to do with the tendency to animalize the presence, the bodies of the Black people, and to place them within the nature. If they were savages, if they were competing at the same level with the animals. For example, in an article that I wrote with Andrea Guerrero Mosquera, we analyzed these representations about Black people in the travelers literature in the 19th century, and we could find a lot of images that were portraying Black people fighting with animals, with crocodiles, with tigers. So that's part of a tendency that began long before. And other scholars, for example, Mimi Scheller, had found these kind of representations also along the colonial history. So all of this dates back to the colonial era and to these prevailing representations of the Black people as barbaric and civilized and closer to the animal kingdom.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bob?
We can't hear you, Bob.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us today. So I kind of have a question about, like, say, the Maroon societies of Jamaica, and I cover that. And I'm curious to think what you might have to say about so the conundrum of the history of having to keep separate and secret, and now in the modern times, ironically, you need to sort of have this outreach to bring in economic benefit. And so, like you say, the mixing is not really happening, but the people are going into the touristic areas, correct?
Sure.
So I guess my question is do tourists then also go into the palenque itself, and is that hard to do? Mm-hmm. And do they have more agency over and less harassment if it goes that way?
Okay, yeah, that's a fantastic question, because that has to do with the ways that the people, that palenqueros themselves, are doing right now. They have tried to even these the inequalities related to these touristic encounters, and they have been participating more into the touristic industry. For example, of course, a lot of tourists now go to Palenque, and that's something that is controlled by the palenqueros themselves.
Right.
They have their hotels, they have their agencies, and they have they have tried to embrace tourism as a form of local development. There is this fascinating work of Candia Obeso. As I said, she's a scholar from Palenquero descent, and she's precisely working on how Palenqueros are embracing tourism and heritage tourism in particular to try to make an earning from tourism. So that's happening. Of course, there are other people involved in those businesses that also have their tours to Palenque, but of course they can't do it without the supervision or the authorization of the Palenqueros themselves. So that's something positive, of course. The way they have an agency on that, and also how they regulate the use of their own image. As I said during the presentation, now they charge for the pictures. Whenever a tourist try to take a picture with them, they charge them for them. They charge the tourists for that. So that's a way, a strategic way of use their image to make an earning from that commodification of their bodies. That's a proof of agency. It's my understanding of that.
Great. And then as a follow-up, is there a use of music involved in this sort of thing? And
sure, yeah, of course, because there are a lot of musicians and practitioners in the town itself. So of course, always music is included in that transaction. Not so much in Cartagena because others also practice, perform in the downtown. That's something that Palenqueros don't do very often. But when tourists go to the town in itself, to Palenque, of course, there is plenty of music there.
And it's I'm saying is traditional, like it's not being sort of influenced by what tourists might want to hear. It's traditional, folkloric.
It is always hard to know the boundaries of how authentic or not the music is.
Right.
But as I said, there are several musicians that are sort of famous that have been doing their practice for quite a long time. So they attach to that pretty much, to the folkloric music. So I would say that there is a bit of both, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Laura, Johanna Hernandez had a question already in the chat.
But she raised her hand, so I don't know if you want to answer herself or Joanna.
Yes. Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to get my question answered if I could. I have to run out to office hours. But yeah, thank you for your presentation. It was really great. I'm actually writing you an email to follow up to. I'm looking for my question. Yeah. So my question was, I was wondering if you could expand on why there was a switch in tourist representations in the 70s that you mentioned. Because as you said, these depictions of the Caribbean have been around for centuries, and you said that government authorities were leaning towards having Cartagena join these ideas of the Caribbean. But I was wondering if you had any idea of why in this particular moment this was happening.
Yes, my hypothesis is that at that moment, the government and entrepreneurs were trying to place Cartagena within the Caribbean market. And that, of course, implied to build the infrastructure necessary to meet the standards of the region, to compete face-to-face with Kingston in Jamaica, with San Juan in Puerto Rico. But my guess is that also there was a need to connect symbolically also with the Caribbean. So I think that it's not a coincidence that the way that Palenqueras are portrayed following the 1970s is pretty similar to the way that already Black female bodies were portrayed in the Caribbean since much earlier. So that's my guess, that there was a need to place Cartagena within that market. Of course, there is a larger process in Colombia, not only in Cartagena, that has to do with the rise of Black intellectuals who are trying to emphasize that Blackness is critical to understand the Colombian culture, a Colombian culture that was thought from the perspective of Hispanidad at first, but there is a wide recognition that Blackness mattered matters in that sense. So I guess there is a bit of both. These Black intellectuals, such as Manuel Zapato Olivella, Delia Zapato Olivella, Jorge Artel, they had like certain influence on the mass media. So I guess that perhaps they had something to do with that as well, to the way that Cartagena was portrayed in the national magazines. But that's some of the questions that I'm trying to answer in my research.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we're taking like the last questions. I think Camilo Espinosa.
Hi, Orlando. Good to see you again, and thanks for your presentation. I want to ask you something that you mentioned during your presentation, but maybe it's not in your research scope, and it is about infrastructure. You mentioned that the Cartagena wall are a symbol of the Hispanidad, and there are also some monuments and bustos of former Spanish conquerors in Cartagena, like the one that is, I think, close to the clock tower, like it's about Pedro Heredia, I think. So, I mean, we can think that this infrastructure is violent because despite they cannot inflict physical damage, symbolically speaking, it's very violent.
Yeah, well, that's, yeah, okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Nevertheless, I think that the people in Cartagena don't see this infrastructure like this. Actually, for me, I think it's the opposite, in the sense that this infrastructure are like contested spaces where people can reaffirm their identities. I mean, this is something I'm working on, but I don't know, what do you think about this?
Yes, I totally agree with that. Of course, these monuments represents the slavery past, or the slavery past of Cartagena. But people in Cartagena don't, of course, they know that that has to do with the slavery past, but they don't see it as a violent exposition, or, I mean, they don't put it in the same terms that, for example, they don't look at it in the same terms that, for example, the monuments of the conquistador. There have been like a lot of discussion about having these conquistadors that massacre the local Indians, to have them in the public space. Of course, there was a debate about that, and there is always people proposing to tear down those monuments. But regarding the walls, it's not the case, because the people have a connection with the wall. They think of themselves, they think of the walls as part of the public space, as something that belongs to the people in Cartagena. So they don't see it as a violent expression of that past. It is, of course, a proof that Cartagena had a colonial past, but people do not feel it that way. And many of the black laborers and people who are now taking advantage of tourism, they do it in the walls of the city as well. So they have incorporated that infrastructure into their touristic labor or practice. So yeah, they don't see it in that sense.
Okay.
Laura, there are like a couple of questions here by Alberto Verdesia. Some of them that I could use the questions to expand on other issues that are critical. For example, he was wondering whether the commodification of black bodies will disappear in Cartagena or will continue because of the Palenqueras income issues. I guess it's not going to disappear. What I'm hoping is going to happen is that black people themselves will be able to control the commodification of their bodies, or regulate their use of their body. And that has been the tendency over the last years. As I said, this practice of charging the tourists for their pictures is an expression of agency over their bodies. So I guess this is not gonna go, but I'm hoping that this agency grows larger and allows the people to have a control of the way that images are portrayed, because they barely had a control of that before. Many of the photographs, for example, were already in the internet without then knowing that the faces and bodies were displayed in the internet, that some people were profiting from their images. Now it's not the case anymore, because the people have a control of that and they are aware of that commodification. So agency is coming. That's my sense, and I hope that really happens.
Yeah, we hope all that happen. Alberto has 2 more questions. I don't know if you want to close with that 2 questions of the chat, because I know time is running, so we can end with that 2 questions that are like more present, I will say, than historically, and we can close with that.
Well, perhaps with the second question, I'm not so familiar with the third one, but well, the second question is wondering about whether there are alternatives to making an income for palenqueras without being accessories, little alive monuments for tourists. There are, of course. I mean, most of the palenqueras are not working in the streets as performers or as street vendors. I mean, there have been a rise of a middle class of palenqueros since the 1980s. They have position. They have gotten into the mainstream society. They are not living in the enclaves anymore. So many of them are professionals. Many of them are into the working class. I mean, that was already the case in the 1980s. Many of them, when they migrated to the city, they went to work in the public institutions. So there is a solid working class and middle class of palenqueros nowadays in Cartagena. So of course there are alternatives, but many of them do not have the chances to access to those social and economic spheres. Many of them are palenqueros or people who were born in Venezuela but are from palenquero descent that came in the last years given the crisis in Venezuela. So that's the only alternative they found in the city. So there are alternatives, of course, but some people have found in the tourism an alternative to make a living.
Okay, I think we can end with that. Muchas gracias, Dr. Deavila. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you so much. Thank you all of you who joined us today to share, to exchange ideas, to grow up intellectually with these topics. And I personally hope that we continue with CLAS support and sponsorship to, contribute and talking and bring Colombia and Caribbean Colombia to the table in the US, and particularly, of course, Rutgers University. So thank you to all of you for joining us, for CLAS, for the support, the Caribbean Working Group too. So thank you, and thank you, Orlando, too.
Thank you.
Okay.
Gracias a todos y a todas.